Hotel Transylvania 2 looks like the kind of movie that should be impossible to take seriously. It has a vampire grandpa chasing a toddler, a werewolf family turning parenting into a full-time safety inspection, a blob with absolutely no dignity, and a group of legendary monsters who spend more time arguing about family than frightening anybody. Yet beneath all that frantic energy is a surprisingly uncomfortable idea. What happens when a parent loves a child so much that they become terrified of allowing that child to become someone different from them? That question is hiding in plain sight from the very beginning, because Dennis is not simply a cute half-human, half-vampire baby. To Dracula, he is a possibility. He is proof that the family legacy can continue. He is the future of everything Dracula has spent centuries protecting. And when Dennis reaches an age where his vampire teeth should have appeared but stubbornly refuses to cooperate, Dracula does something that sounds hilarious until you think about what it actually means. He starts trying to manufacture an identity for his grandson. The secret training, the monster exercises, the increasingly ridiculous attempts to trigger Dennis's supernatural instincts all become a miniature version of something much more recognizable. The parent or grandparent who looks at a child and thinks, "You need to become what I expected you to become." That is why Hotel Transylvania 2 is more interesting than its premise suggests. It is not secretly a horror movie, but it is a horror comedy about a very modern fear. The fear that your children will inherit everything except the part of your identity you desperately wanted them to keep. Dracula's obsession with Dennis's fangs becomes an exaggerated version of generational pressure, cultural expectation, and even assimilation. The film asks whether heritage survives because we force the next generation to perform it, or because we give them enough freedom to choose what is worth carrying forward. And that becomes especially fascinating when the story places Dracula's gothic world against Johnny's ordinary human upbringing. Dennis belongs to both worlds, which means he can never perfectly satisfy either one. His existence challenges the fantasy that identity can be inherited like an antique. Dracula can hand him a castle, a family name, a history, and 1,000 years of stories, but none of those things guarantee that Dennis will become the monster Dracula recognizes. That is where the film's supposedly silly vampire boot camp starts to feel almost like a satire of toxic perfectionism. Dracula is not trying to hurt Dennis because he hates him. He is pushing him because he loves him, and that is precisely what makes the behavior complicated. The most dangerous expectations are often the ones disguised as love. A child can be pressured not because a family rejects them, but because a family is terrified of losing itself through them. For a large-scale studio animated comedy released in 2015, that is an unexpectedly sophisticated psychological engine. The jokes move quickly, the animation is exaggerated, and the characters behave like living cartoon physics, but underneath the noise is a story about inheritance, belonging, aging, and the terrifying realization that love sometimes requires you to surrender control. And once you see Hotel Transylvania 2 through that lens, the entire movie changes. The question stops being whether Dennis will grow fangs. The real question becomes much more uncomfortable. If he never does, can Dracula still love him without feeling that something has been lost? And if the answer is yes, why does Dracula spend so much of the movie trying to prove the opposite? That question is the thread that connects everything that follows, because Hotel Transylvania 2 is working on several levels at once. On the surface, it is a fast-moving family comedy, built around a familiar group of characters returning for another supernatural adventure. Underneath that surface, it is a story about grandparents who cannot accept that the world is changing, parents who are caught between two cultures, and children who are expected to carry an identity they never personally chose. To understand why the film works when it works, and why its weaker moments feel so obvious, we have to move beyond the basic plot and examine how Genndy Tartakovsky's visual style turns those ideas into physical comedy. We have to go back to the production history, because the sequel arrived at a very specific moment for Sony Pictures Animation, when the studio was trying to prove that it could compete in a crowded animation marketplace without simply copying the dominant formulas around it. We have to look at the film's 2015 environment, when Pixar had already demonstrated that animation could openly discuss complicated emotional psychology. Illumination was proving the enormous commercial value of simple character-driven comedy, and DreamWorks remained one of the industry's most recognizable animation brands. Hotel Transylvania 2 had to find another route. It did that through speed, exaggerated movement, recognizable voices, monster nostalgia, and the very particular sensibility of Tartakovsky, a filmmaker whose artistic language had been shaped in television animation long before he entered the world of feature films. From there, the story itself becomes our map. We begin with Mavis and Johnny's marriage and the birth of Dennis, because that is where the film introduces its central contradiction. A family that has already crossed a cultural boundary now has to decide what that crossing means for the next generation. Then we follow Mavis as she starts imagining a safer, more ordinary future for her son, while Dracula becomes increasingly convinced that ordinary is another word for disappearance. Their competing visions eventually send the story toward California, where the supposedly frightening monster world is contrasted with the aggressively normal world of suburbia. Then comes Dracula's secret mission to awaken Dennis's vampire side, the road trip with the old Drac Pack, and the realization that even the monsters themselves have changed. They are no longer terrifying creatures lurking outside civilization. They have smartphones, families, routines, and problems that look suspiciously human. The midpoint crisis turns all of that comedy into genuine emotional conflict, when Dracula's desperation goes too far and Mavis discovers what he has been doing behind her back. From there, the arrival of Vlad transforms the personal argument into a generational confrontation. Vlad represents an older, harder version of monster tradition, one that has no interest in compromise. His presence forces Dracula to confront the possibility that the values he thought he was protecting can become destructive when taken to their extreme. Finally, the film brings everything together through Dennis, whose transformation does not happen because Dracula successfully trains him. It happens because Dennis chooses to protect someone he loves. That distinction matters. It allows the movie to move from conditional identity to unconditional love. Along the way, we will examine Dracula as both protagonist and source of conflict, Mavis as a mother trying not to repeat the fears of her own childhood, Johnny as the human bridge between two worlds, and the Drac Pack as a hilarious portrait of aging monsters who have discovered that society no longer fears them. We will also look at the visual language of the film, the difference between Gothic verticality and suburban flatness, the way color separates the hotel from California, and the physical design of Dennis as a literal combination of his parents' worlds. Then we will step behind the screen to examine Tartakovsky's approach to CG animation, where poses, timing, silhouettes, squash and stretch, and kinetic movement become just as important as dialogue. Finally, we will ask the larger question: what did Hotel Transylvania 2 mean for Sony Pictures Animation? And why does a seemingly disposable monster comedy matter in the history of modern studio animation? Because the strange thing about the film is that its central conflict mirrors the industry's own situation. The characters are trying to preserve a legacy while adapting to a new generation. Sony Pictures Animation was doing exactly the same thing. And that is where the production story begins. The original Hotel Transylvania arrived in 2012 and immediately demonstrated that a monster comedy could become more than a one-off novelty. It had recognizable horror icons, an accessible family premise, a strong comedic cast, and a visual identity that separated it from more conventional CG animation. Most importantly, it created a world that could support more stories. Once the first film became successful, the idea of a sequel was less a question of possibility than inevitability. The challenge was making sure the sequel could expand the franchise without losing the peculiar energy that made the original stand out. Bringing Genndy Tartakovsky back into the director's chair was therefore significant. Tartakovsky had spent years developing one of the most distinctive visual languages in television animation. His work on Dexter's Laboratory and Samurai Jack had trained audiences to understand his storytelling through movement, composition, silhouettes, timing, and sudden shifts in scale. His characters could communicate through a single pose. A body could stretch beyond anatomical logic and still feel emotionally precise. A pause could be funnier than a paragraph of dialogue. A simple turn of the head could become a punchline. Moving from that environment into feature animation meant adapting those instincts to a much larger production pipeline. CG animation has its own limitations and efficiencies. Characters are built as digital models. Rigs are designed to perform particular movements. Environments need to survive multiple camera angles. And every action has to be planned with an enormous number of departments in mind. Tartakovsky's challenge was not simply to direct a CG movie. It was to make CG animation behave like his cartoons without making the result feel like a traditional television episode stretched to feature length. That distinction explains much of Hotel Transylvania 2's visual personality. The film does not behave like a realistic three-dimensional world. It behaves like a cartoon that happens to exist in three-dimensional space. Bodies bend. Faces distort. Characters accelerate with impossible force and stop with equally impossible precision. A character can occupy one shape for a fraction of a second and then become something completely different in the next frame. That exaggeration is not merely decorative. It is part of the storytelling grammar. Dracula's emotional instability becomes visible because his body is incapable of remaining still. When he panics, his entire silhouette seems to vibrate. When he is confident, he expands. When he is embarrassed, he collapses. The animation externalizes psychology. But the studio environment around Tartakovsky was changing too. Sony Pictures Animation needed a broader family franchise, and a sequel naturally offered a way to deepen the commercial identity of the property. The film had to appeal to children, parents, fans of the original, and audiences who might simply recognize the voices involved. That is where the Adam Sandler connection became particularly important. Sandler and the Happy Madison comedic ecosystem had become closely associated with the Hotel Transylvania films, and the cast brought a recognizable comedic rhythm to the material. The screenplay, developed with contributions from Sandler, Robert Smigel, and other writers, emphasized character-based comedy and family dysfunction, rather than attempting to turn the franchise into a conventional action adventure. That dad-centric comedic voice is crucial. The jokes frequently come from adults behaving like children, children behaving like adults, and supposedly powerful monsters discovering that parenting is much harder than fighting. Dracula may be centuries old, But emotionally he can resemble the nervous father who has no idea what he is doing and therefore becomes convinced that doing everything is the only possible solution. The sequel's production circumstances also created an interesting tension between auteur direction and franchise expectations. Tartakovsky wanted movement and expressive visual comedy. The studio needed recognizable characters, clear storytelling, broad appeal, and a film that could function as a commercial sequel. Those objectives are not automatically compatible. A director can want to linger on an unusual visual gag, while a studio wants the story to keep moving. A comedic actor can improvise a line while an animator has already spent months building a scene around a specific rhythm. A franchise can promise familiarity, while an artist wants to experiment. Hotel Transylvania 2 succeeds when those forces reinforce each other instead of fighting each other. Its weaknesses become more apparent when the formula begins to show through the surface. Still, the most important production decision was bringing the same visual voice back. The sequel could have been a routine continuation. Instead, Tartakovsky treated the characters as tools for increasingly physical storytelling. Dracula was not simply given new dialogue. He was given new ways to move. Dennis was not simply a cute child. He became a visual question mark whose body could shift between human innocence and supernatural possibility. The Drac Pack became a collection of animated shapes whose age and personalities could be expressed through movement. Even the environments became opportunities for kinetic comedy. This approach allowed the sequel to feel larger without necessarily feeling more generic. That mattered because the movie entered theaters during one of the most competitive periods for animated family entertainment. By autumn 2015, audiences had already seen Pixar's Inside Out and Illumination's Minions, two films that represented very different approaches to commercial animation. Inside Out demonstrated the continued power of emotional sophistication, turning abstract psychology into accessible characters. Minions demonstrated how simple visual personalities and relentless comic energy could become a global commercial phenomenon. Hotel Transylvania 2 had to exist between those poles. It was not trying to become a philosophical meditation in the Pixar tradition, even though it contained psychological themes. It was not built around a nearly wordless visual mascot in the Illumination mold, even though its creatures were instantly recognizable. Instead, it sold an ensemble, a premise, and a very specific brand of fast-moving comedy. The timing also mattered. The original film had performed strongly enough to establish a September tradition for the franchise, a period when family audiences could be attracted before the holiday animation rush fully arrived. That meant the sequel entered theaters with momentum. Audiences already knew Dracula, Mavis, Johnny, Frankenstein, Murray, Wayne, Griffin, and the rest of the group. Marketing could therefore focus on the new question: what happens when Dracula becomes a grandfather? The promotional campaign leaned heavily on that premise because it was immediately understandable. You did not need to know the entire mythology of vampires to understand the joke. Dracula had a baby grandson, and the baby might not become a vampire. The casting also remained a major part of the marketing appeal. Adam Sandler, Selena Gomez, Andy Samberg, Kevin James, David Spade, Steve Buscemi, Fran Drescher, and other familiar voices created the sense that this was a returning comedy ensemble, rather than a completely new animated property. That distinction is important because voice recognition works differently from visual star power. Audiences may not consciously think about the actor behind an animated character, but the personality of the performer shapes the rhythm of every joke. Sandler's Dracula is frantic, insecure, and emotionally immature in a way that fits the character's physical movement. Gomez's Mavis balances youthful energy with increasing maternal responsibility. Samberg's Johnny is deliberately chaotic and enthusiastic, which makes him an ideal counterweight to Dracula's obsessive planning. The film's commercial strategy was therefore straightforward. Return to a familiar world, add a baby, raise the family stakes, and make the animation even faster. But beneath that marketable premise was a more interesting transformation. The first film was fundamentally about Dracula learning to accept Johnny. The sequel is about Dracula learning to accept Dennis. In other words, the first story asks whether an outsider can enter the family. The second asks whether the family can accept that its own future may look different from its past. That is a much more difficult problem because the outsider is no longer outside. The future is already sitting at the dinner table. The story begins after the emotional breakthrough of the first film, with Mavis and Johnny's relationship now fully accepted by Dracula. Their wedding represents more than a romantic conclusion. It is the visual proof that the boundaries Dracula once considered absolute have already begun to disappear. A human has entered the monster family, and instead of destroying the family, he has become part of it. That development sets up the sequel's central irony. Dracula successfully learns to accept one cultural change, only to discover that the next one is much harder. Mavis and Johnny have a son, Dennis, and from the moment he arrives, everyone begins interpreting him according to their own expectations. To Johnny, Dennis is simply his child. To Mavis, he is a child who needs to be protected. To Dracula, he is potentially the next vampire in a long family line. The hotel itself becomes a strange domestic environment where humans and monsters coexist so naturally that the original premise has almost disappeared. What once seemed impossible is now ordinary. That is how generational change works. The impossible becomes normal faster than the previous generation can emotionally process it. Mavis's own transformation is especially important. In the first movie, she was desperate to see the outside world because Dracula's fear had kept her isolated. Now she has become a mother, and that experience changes her relationship with danger. The woman who once wanted freedom now starts thinking about safety. She begins imagining what life in a normal human environment could offer Dennis. The irony is almost perfect. Dracula spent Mavis's childhood protecting her from the human world, and now Mavis is considering moving her own child toward that world. She is not necessarily rejecting her monster heritage. She is simply asking whether Dennis needs to grow up surrounded by danger just because she did. Dracula cannot see the situation that way. He becomes fixated on Dennis's lack of vampire teeth, especially as the child's 5th birthday approaches. In the mythology of the film, the absence of fangs creates uncertainty about whether Dennis will become a vampire at all. For Dracula, uncertainty is unbearable. He begins watching Dennis for signs, waiting for the transformation that will prove his family line is secure. Every ordinary human behavior becomes evidence that Dennis might be drifting away from him. Dennis likes things that look human. Dennis does not automatically behave like a monster. Dennis does not respond to Dracula's expectations. The more Dracula observes, the more anxious he becomes. What makes this funny is that the child himself is not worried. Dennis is simply being a child. The crisis exists almost entirely inside the adults. That is one of the movie's most effective ideas. Adults can create enormous emotional dramas around decisions that children do not yet understand. Dracula turns the absence of fangs into an existential emergency because he has attached his own identity to the outcome. If Dennis becomes a vampire, Dracula can tell himself that the family legacy is safe. If Dennis does not, then Dracula has to confront a future he cannot control. That is why his secret training begins to feel less like a rescue mission and more like a psychological experiment. He tries different situations designed to trigger Dennis's supernatural instincts. He wants the child to prove something. But the more Dracula tries to force the transformation, the more obvious it becomes that he is not actually seeing Dennis. He is seeing the future he wants Dennis to represent. At the same time, Mavis and Johnny begin considering California as a possible home. Their visit to Santa Cruz is deliberately contrasted with the hotel. The hotel is vertical, gothic, crowded, dark, and filled with supernatural history. California is open, bright, ordinary, and almost aggressively safe. There are no centuries-old towers, no haunted forests, no monster legends hiding behind every door. There are streets, houses, beaches, schools, and neighbors. To Dracula, that environment represents the slow disappearance of everything he loves. To Mavis, it represents a chance for Dennis to grow up without inheriting fear. The disagreement is therefore not simply about geography. It is about what kind of childhood each adult believes a child deserves. Dracula thinks childhood should be connected to heritage and tradition. Mavis thinks childhood should be protected from unnecessary danger. Johnny, meanwhile, sits between the two because he understands the human world but has fully embraced the monster family. His presence reminds us that identity does not have to be a choice between two boxes. It can be a mixture. When Mavis and Johnny leave to explore California more seriously, Dracula sees an opportunity. He can finally take Dennis somewhere that might awaken the vampire within him. Instead of accepting uncertainty, he decides to manufacture a test. The plan becomes a secret road trip with the original Drac Pack. Frankenstein, Wayne, Griffin, and Murray join him, and their presence transforms the mission into something that looks like a monster version of a family vacation. But there is another layer to their involvement. These creatures are supposed to represent the old world, yet they have changed too. Frankenstein is no longer the terrifying creation from classic horror. Wayne is a tired father with a huge family of his own. Griffin's invisibility is less frightening than inconvenient. Murray is essentially a walking piece of ancient history who has become a comedic friend. They are not relics frozen in time. They have adapted. That means Dracula's mission is partly a denial of reality. He is asking Dennis to become something that even his own generation of monsters has stopped being. The road trip becomes a journey through the ruins of their own mythology. They travel through places that should feel dangerous but no longer do. The dark forest is not quite as dark as the legends promised. Old monster territory has become harmless. Camp Winnepecaca, once imagined as a place of danger and chaos, has been transformed by modern safety culture into something almost absurdly controlled. The monsters encounter warning signs, protective equipment, organized activities, and adults whose first instinct is to make sure nobody gets hurt. The comedy comes from contrast. These characters belong to folklore built around fear, yet they now live in a world where danger is something that requires paperwork. The old monsters are becoming obsolete not because they have become weaker, but because society has changed around them. Nobody runs screaming from a vampire anymore. Nobody automatically believes a werewolf is a threat. Nobody treats a mummy as a supernatural nightmare when the mummy is standing around complaining about family problems. Their frightening identities have become costumes. For Dracula, that realization is painful. He does not simply want Dennis to have fangs because fangs are cool. He wants Dennis to confirm that the world he came from still matters. Every failed attempt makes him more desperate. Dennis remains human. He does not transform on command. He does not respond to the old rituals. The Drac Pack can laugh about it, but Dracula cannot. His desperation eventually reaches a point where comedy begins to feel uncomfortable. He becomes willing to take increasingly dangerous risks because he believes one dramatic moment will reveal Dennis's true nature. The irony is that Dennis's true nature is already obvious. He is affectionate, curious, sensitive, playful, and deeply connected to the people around him. The movie is quietly telling us that identity is not something a test can reveal. Love reveals it. That lesson becomes unavoidable when Dracula's plan crosses the line. Believing that Dennis may be able to fly if he is placed in a terrifying situation, Dracula takes him to a decaying tower and drops him, hoping instinct will activate the vampire abilities he has been waiting for. The scene is presented with the exaggerated physical comedy of the film, but its emotional logic is serious. Dracula has allowed fear of losing Dennis to overpower his judgment. He is no longer encouraging a child to discover himself. He is forcing the child into danger to satisfy an adult expectation, and then the consequences escape his control. The event is captured on video and spreads publicly, turning a private family failure into a viral spectacle. The modern world enters the Gothic family conflict through the smartphone screen. Dracula's old-fashioned anxieties are now being judged by a digital audience. What he thought was a private attempt to preserve family heritage becomes evidence of reckless behavior. For Mavis, the video is devastating because it confirms her worst fear. Dracula has not merely failed to accept Dennis as he is. He has placed Dennis in danger because he could not accept uncertainty. The argument between Mavis and Dracula therefore carries the emotional weight of both generations. Mavis accuses him of repeating the same controlling behavior he once used with her. Dracula insists that he was trying to help. Both statements can be true. He loves his grandson, and his behavior is still harmful. That distinction is essential to the movie's emotional intelligence. Love does not automatically make control healthy. Good intentions do not erase consequences. Mavis decides that after Dennis's 5th birthday, she will move with Johnny and Dennis to California. To Dracula, this feels like history repeating itself. He once lost his daughter to the outside world, and now he fears losing his grandson as well. The emotional wound underneath his behavior finally becomes visible. Dracula has spent years protecting his family from loss, but his fear of losing them makes him behave in ways that can push them away. The birthday party therefore becomes more than a celebration. It is a final negotiation over identity. And into that already complicated family gathering comes Vlad, Dracula's father and Dennis's great-grandfather, voiced by Mel Brooks. Vlad represents the older generation in its most concentrated form. He is not interested in compromise, suburban acceptance, or cultural blending. His worldview is much simpler. Monsters are monsters, humans are humans, and tradition must be preserved. His arrival externalizes the conflict that has been living inside Dracula. Until this point, Dracula has been able to tell himself that his efforts are reasonable. Vlad makes it clear where that logic leads when taken to its extreme. The old generation does not see Dennis as a unique child. It sees him as a test of the family bloodline. If Dennis does not become a vampire, then something has gone wrong. The concept of unconditional love is challenged by an older belief in conditional belonging. Vlad's presence also creates an important contrast with Dracula. Dracula is flawed, but he is capable of changing. Vlad initially represents the possibility of refusing to change at all. He carries the weight of ancient tradition, and seems almost amused by the idea that Dracula has become too soft. Then the situation becomes violent when Bella and the Bat Monsters attack. Bella's hostility toward humans pushes the film's prejudice metaphor into a much darker space. The distinction between monsters and humans is no longer playful. It becomes a question of whether hatred can be inherited, and whether it can be interrupted. When Bella attacks Winnie, Dennis's beloved werewolf friend, the emotional logic of the entire movie suddenly reverses. Dracula spent the whole story trying to force Dennis's vampire instincts to appear through fear. Bella's attack triggers them through love. That difference is everything. Dennis does not become powerful because someone scares him into becoming a monster. He becomes powerful because someone he loves is in danger. His transformation is not proof that Dracula's training worked. It is proof that Dennis already possessed an identity that could not be reduced to fangs. He is a vampire when it matters, but he is also human when it matters. He is both. His power emerges from connection rather than obedience. The final battle becomes a visual expression of that idea, with Dennis moving through the chaos not as a representative of one side, but as a child whose two worlds have finally stopped fighting inside him. Dracula eventually recognizes that the thing he feared most was never Dennis becoming human. It was the possibility that Dennis might not need him to define who he was. This realization completes Dracula's character arc. In the first film, Dracula learns to let Mavis leave the hotel and enter a relationship with Johnny. In the sequel, he has to learn something harder. He cannot decide what his grandson will become simply because he is afraid of losing his family's identity. His surface goal is obvious from the beginning. He wants Dennis to become a vampire. But beneath that goal is a deeper psychological need. Dracula wants proof that he still matters. He wants proof that his history has survived. He wants to know that the family he spent centuries protecting will not disappear into a future he cannot recognize. That fear is connected to the trauma of losing Martha, the love of his life, and to the broader fear of watching the world change while he remains emotionally attached to the past. Dennis becomes the vessel into which Dracula pours all of those anxieties. If Dennis has fangs, then Dracula can believe that the future is secure. If Dennis does not, then Dracula has to accept that survival can mean transformation. That makes Dracula a particularly interesting metaphor for aging patriarchs. He is powerful, wealthy, experienced, and surrounded by a family that loves him. Yet he is emotionally insecure because he cannot control cultural change. The more the world moves forward, the more he tries to recreate the conditions of the past. His mansion becomes a fortress not just against physical danger but against time itself. The hotel is filled with old objects, old traditions, old stories, and old monsters. But Mavis and Johnny have already transformed that space. Humans are welcome. Families are mixed. The boundaries have blurred. Dracula's real struggle is therefore not with California. It is with history. He wants history to remain recognizable because recognizable history makes him feel safe. Vlad takes that anxiety and makes it more extreme. As Dracula's father, he embodies a tradition that existed before compromise. Mel Brooks's performance is important because it brings a comic sense of old-school theatrical authority to the character. Vlad can be funny without becoming harmless. He is the living reminder that Dracula's beliefs did not originate with him. They were inherited. That matters because prejudice in the film is presented less as an individual defect and more as a generational pattern. Dracula is not born knowing that Dennis must be a vampire. He learns to associate family love with cultural continuity. Vlad learned it from an even older world. Bella represents what happens when those inherited ideas are stripped of affection and turned into outright hostility. His aggression toward humans is the endpoint of a belief system that refuses to accept difference. Mavis and Johnny offer the alternative. Mavis begins the film overcorrecting towards safety, but her development allows her to recognize that Dennis does not need to be protected from either side of his heritage. She once wanted to escape Dracula's restrictions. Now she has to avoid becoming equally restrictive in the opposite direction. Her instinct is understandable. She remembers what it felt like to be trapped, so she wants to make sure Dennis never feels that way. But protection can become another form of control when it refuses to let a child explore. Her eventual acceptance of Dennis's supernatural identity demonstrates that she is not choosing the monster world over the human world. She is choosing her son over the categories surrounding him. Johnny is arguably the most important bridge in the entire story because he has already accomplished what Dennis represents. He entered a monster family without abandoning his human identity. He did not need to become a vampire to belong. He simply became part of the family through love. His enthusiasm can make him seem childish compared with Dracula's centuries of experience, but emotionally Johnny often understands the situation more clearly. He is comfortable with difference because difference is normal to him. He does not spend his time asking whether Dennis is human enough or vampire enough. Dennis is his son. That is enough. The Drac Pack provides the comedic reflection of this generational conflict. They are supposed to be the terrifying monsters of old folklore. Yet they have become exhausted parents, awkward friends, and aging creatures trying to function in a modern world. Their tragedy is funny because it is familiar. Everyone ages. Everyone watches the world change. Everyone eventually discovers that the things that once made them feel special are no longer automatically valued by younger generations. Frankenstein, Wayne, Griffin, and Murray are not defeated by humans. They are defeated by irrelevance. The world has simply moved on. Their response is not to disappear but to adapt, even when they complain about it. That idea leads directly into the film's central theme. Identity is often negotiated through family performance. Dennis's fangs become a visual shortcut for a much larger cultural question. What happens when a child belongs to more than one world? Older generations may expect that child to preserve traditions in a specific form. They may want the child to speak a certain language, follow certain customs, respect certain rituals, or reproduce a family identity exactly as it existed before. But children do not experience heritage as a museum exhibit. They remix it. They combine influences. They absorb the world around them. Dennis is literally designed around that mixture. His hair carries Johnny's wild orange energy, while his face and coloring retain Dracula's pale, refined features. He is not visually split into two halves. He is blended. That is why Fangs versus No Fangs works as an allegory for bicultural identity, even though the film never states the metaphor directly. The question is not whether Dennis is enough of one thing. The question is why anyone believes he has to be only one thing. Dracula's mistake is assuming that cultural survival requires perfect replication. The film suggests the opposite. Traditions survive by changing shape. A family legacy that cannot adapt eventually becomes a museum piece. The hotel itself is evidence. It began as a fortress designed to separate monsters from humans. By the sequel, it has become a place where the two groups live together. The world did not destroy Dracula's heritage by changing it. It allowed that heritage to continue in a new form. This also explains why the movie's strongest emotional idea is unconditional acceptance. Conditional pride says, "I am proud of you because you represent what I value." Unconditional love says, "I am proud of you even when you become something I did not expect." Dracula spends most of the movie stuck between those two ideas. He loves Dennis, but he also wants Dennis to validate him. The resolution works because Dracula finally understands that those are not the same thing. Dennis's identity does not exist to make Dracula feel successful. Dennis exists to become himself. The visual language reinforces this conflict constantly. The hotel is built around vertical architecture. Towers rise upward, hallways twist, staircases climb, windows frame enormous Gothic spaces, and characters frequently move through multiple levels of the environment. It is a world of height, depth, history, and enclosed tradition. Santa Cruz and suburban California are visually flatter and more open. Roads stretch horizontally. Houses sit in neat rows. The sky is enormous. There is less mystery because there are fewer places for shadows to hide. The contrast is almost comically direct. The monster world looks dangerous but feels like home, while the human world looks safe but initially feels alien to Dracula. Color reinforces the distinction. The hotel tends toward deep reds, purples, dark blues, and rich Gothic tones. Those colors make the supernatural world feel warm despite its darkness. The monsters live in shadows, but those shadows are familiar. California is brighter, cleaner, and more saturated with sunlight and modern surfaces. The brightness can feel almost sterile compared with the hotel's visual density. That is important because the film refuses to make either environment completely good or completely bad. Darkness is not automatically dangerous. Light is not automatically comforting. The real danger comes from the attitudes people carry into those spaces. Dennis's design sits between the worlds. His orange hair visually echoes Johnny, making his human connection immediately readable, while his pale features and expressive eyes echo Dracula. He looks like a character who has already solved the identity problem the adults are still arguing about. The adults see categories. The design shows combination. The film also uses its comedy to satirize modern parenting. Camp Winnepecaca becomes an exaggerated version of a childhood environment where every possible danger has been identified, labeled, softened, and removed. The monsters arrive expecting something wild and discover a world where safety has become its own form of absurdity. That gag works because it reflects a genuine cultural shift. Childhood has increasingly become structured around supervision, risk management, digital entertainment, and constant monitoring. The movie exaggerates that reality until it becomes ridiculous. A group of ancient monsters, creatures whose entire mythology is based on danger, are horrified by how carefully modern society has sanitized the idea of danger. The joke is not that safety is bad. The joke is that a childhood with no uncertainty can become strangely lifeless. Folklore itself depends on uncertainty. A forest is frightening because you do not know what is inside it. A dark castle works because shadows allow imagination to fill the gaps. Modern technology can reduce those gaps. A phone can identify a location. A screen can explain the monster. A search engine can answer the question before the mystery has time to grow. Hotel Transylvania 2 plays with that tension by placing ancient creatures inside a world that increasingly explains everything. That is also why the movie's monster heritage can be understood as a metaphor for cultural folklore under pressure from modernization. The monsters are not merely fictional characters. They are remnants of stories that once frightened audiences before digital culture turned fear into entertainment. Dracula, Frankenstein, the werewolf, the mummy, and the Invisible Man have been transformed from horror icons into family-friendly comedy figures. The film acknowledges that transformation rather than pretending it has not happened. The monsters are now products of a global entertainment culture that has repackaged them for a younger audience. The irony is that the movie is itself participating in the process it satirizes. It takes old folklore, modernizes it, and sells the result as a colorful family franchise. Yet because Tartakovsky's visual style remains rooted in exaggerated cartoon expression, the transformation feels energetic rather than purely corporate. That visual energy is one of the film's greatest production achievements. Tartakovsky's approach to CG animation is built around the idea that a character does not have to obey realistic anatomy to feel physically convincing. In fact, exaggeration can make emotion clearer. A traditional realistic animation approach might show Dracula falling from a tower with physically accurate motion. Tartakovsky's style asks a different question. What shape communicates panic most effectively? The answer may be a body stretched impossibly long, a face compressed into an extreme expression, or a silhouette that changes dramatically between frames. The physics are not realistic, but the emotion is. This is where the influence of 2D animation becomes obvious. Traditional hand-drawn animation depends heavily on key poses. The animator decides what the character looks like at the most important moments, then creates movement between those poses. CG animation can theoretically produce smooth movement with enormous detail, but Tartakovsky's style often prioritizes the clarity of those key poses. A character can move quickly because the audience understands the beginning and ending shapes immediately. The movement becomes a visual sentence with a strong first word and a strong final word. Squash and stretch is another important part of the language. Characters compress when they land, stretch when they accelerate, and deform when they react. These techniques were fundamental to classic animation because they created the illusion of weight and energy without realistic physics. In Hotel Transylvania 2, they also create comedy. A joke can become funnier simply because the character's body reacts one frame longer than expected. A head can stretch into an expression that would be impossible in reality, allowing the audience to read the emotional state instantly. The tower sequence is an especially clear example of this philosophy. The environment is not treated as a static location. It becomes an animated participant. Wood breaks, structures collapse, characters bounce, bodies stretch, and momentum carries the action forward. The same principle applies to the high-speed bat sequences, where Dracula's supernatural ability becomes an excuse for the film to move through space at exaggerated speed. The camera can follow characters through enormous distances while maintaining a cartoon rhythm. The result feels closer to a hand-drawn action sequence translated into CG than to a conventional realistic animated chase. Tartakovsky's directorial fingerprints are equally visible in his use of silence. Animation is often associated with dialogue-heavy comedy, especially in films built around celebrity voices. Hotel Transylvania 2 certainly uses its voice cast extensively, but some of its strongest jokes come from moments where characters simply react. A pause before a movement, a look across a room, a character slowly realizing what has happened, or an exaggerated physical response can communicate more than a line of dialogue. This is where Tartakovsky's television background becomes an advantage. He understands that visual storytelling does not have to stop when the characters stop speaking. That rhythm becomes particularly important because the film is surrounded by a huge amount of dialogue. Sandler's comedic style depends on vocal personality, and the ensemble is packed with performers who can generate jokes quickly. Tartakovsky's visual direction prevents the movie from becoming nothing more than a series of celebrity voices talking over animation. He creates a physical world that is constantly reacting. A character's body may deliver the punchline before the actor finishes the sentence. The score supports that movement. Mark Mothersbaugh's music blends Gothic associations with contemporary energy, allowing the movie to reference horror without becoming frightening. Traditional sounds associated with haunted environments can be combined with upbeat rhythms, creating a musical contradiction that mirrors the film's entire premise. A harpsichord, organ-like textures, choral elements, and orchestral gestures can suggest ancient monster mythology, while faster contemporary rhythms remind us that these monsters now belong to a modern comedy. Dracula's musical identity often carries a sense of theatrical nobility, but that dignity can be interrupted by frantic comic rhythms whenever his anxiety takes over. Dennis, by contrast, is associated with lighter emotional energy. His presence does not feel ominous, even when the film is discussing his supernatural potential. That contrast matters because the score subtly refuses to frame Dennis's human side as a problem. His innocence has its own musical language. The eventual third-act conflict can therefore build tension by bringing those emotional textures together. The music does not simply tell us that a battle is coming. It reminds us what the characters are fighting for. Songs perform a different function. A track such as Fifth Harmony's I'm in Love with a Monster places the movie firmly inside mid-2010s youth culture, while simultaneously playing with the monster concept. The song is catchy, contemporary, and intentionally detached from the gothic seriousness associated with classic horror. That is exactly the point. The franchise is about taking old monster imagery and placing it inside modern entertainment culture. Pop music makes that transformation audible. Sound design works similarly. Cartoon effects such as pops, stretches, impacts, and exaggerated whooshes are layered with creature sounds, environmental ambience, and physical textures. A monster growl can be followed by a ridiculous sound effect. A body can hit a surface with impossible force and produce a deliberately artificial impact. The audience understands that the sound is not realistic, but the timing makes it feel physically satisfying. Comedy depends on rhythm, and sound is part of that rhythm. Quietness is just as important. A noisy scene becomes funnier when it follows an awkward silence. A character can say something ridiculous and then wait for another character's reaction. The absence of sound creates anticipation. Then the chaos arrives. This is another area where Tartakovsky's understanding of timing distinguishes the film from a generic animated comedy. The jokes are not only written, they are choreographed. The film's release also demonstrated how powerful the Hotel Transylvania brand had become. When Hotel Transylvania 2 arrived in September 2015, it opened to approximately $47.5 million domestically, setting a September opening weekend record at the time. That number was more than a financial statistic. It demonstrated that the franchise had established a reliable family audience outside the traditional holiday animation cycle. Families knew the characters, children recognized the visual style, and adults recognized the comedic voices. The film did not need to explain why these monsters belonged together. The audience already knew. Its social media presence further amplified that recognition. Characters such as Blobby became highly shareable because their designs were simple and their expressions were instantly readable. Dracula's frantic reactions also translated naturally into memes and short clips. That is an important part of modern animation's cultural life. A character no longer exists only inside the movie. A funny expression can become a reaction image, a short video, a GIF, or a social media reference within hours. Hotel Transylvania 2's exaggerated visual language was particularly well suited to that environment. Audience response reflected the accessibility of the movie. Families could enjoy the slapstick while adults could recognize the parental anxiety underneath it. Children could focus on Dennis and the monsters. Parents could see themselves in Mavis, Johnny, or Dracula. Grandparents could recognize the fear of watching younger generations make different choices. That multi-generational accessibility helped the film maintain strong word of mouth, even though critics were more divided. The critical response is where the movie's limitations become clearer. Many critics saw a sequel that repeated familiar formulas, relied heavily on physical comedy, and sometimes felt structurally scattered. The emotional themes were present, but the plot could move from one gag to another so quickly that deeper ideas were occasionally underdeveloped. Compared with a film like Inside Out, which built its entire structure around a carefully integrated emotional metaphor, Hotel Transylvania 2 can feel almost impatient. It has something to say, but it rarely pauses long enough to explain itself. Audiences were often more forgiving because the movie's emotional accessibility compensated for its structural imperfections. A family does not necessarily need every plot point to be perfectly engineered if the characters are enjoyable and the central relationship feels genuine. Hotel Transylvania 2 understands that. Its biggest strength is not originality of plot. It is personality. The characters move, react, argue, panic, and love each other with such speed that the film can survive predictable story beats. This is also why Sandler-adjacent animation can divide critics and mainstream audiences. The humor is intentionally broad. It is not embarrassed by silliness. A character can make an absurd face, a monster can behave stupidly, and a carefully constructed visual sequence can end with a deliberately childish joke. Critics looking for elegant narrative construction may find that frustrating. Families looking for an energetic comedy may find it exactly right. The film does have genuine weaknesses. Some modern technology jokes feel inserted more for contemporary relevance than for story necessity. Smartphones and digital devices occasionally function as convenient comedy props rather than organic parts of the world. That is not unusual for a 2015 animated film, but it can make certain moments feel more dated as the years pass. A joke built around a specific device or social media behavior can age much faster than a joke built around family conflict. The biggest structural criticism may be the resolution itself. Dennis's fangs arrive at essentially the last possible moment, creating a neat answer to the central question. It is emotionally satisfying, but it also creates an uncomfortable complication. The film spends so much time telling us that Dennis should be accepted regardless of whether he becomes a vampire, then ultimately confirms that he is a vampire after all. The message remains love him either way, but the narrative outcome still rewards the identity Dracula wanted. That tension is worth acknowledging rather than ignoring. If Dennis had never grown fangs, Dracula would have been forced to demonstrate unconditional acceptance in a much more difficult way. Instead, the story gives him the outcome he wanted while allowing him to learn that he should not have demanded it. The lesson works emotionally, but it is less radical than it could have been. The movie asks us to believe that Dracula has changed, while simultaneously giving him proof that his original hopes were not entirely misplaced. Yet perhaps that compromise is part of what makes the film accessible. Family animation often has to balance emotional complexity with satisfying resolution. A completely ambiguous ending might have been more philosophically daring but less conventionally rewarding. Hotel Transylvania 2 chooses the safer path. It gives Dennis his vampire transformation while redefining what that transformation means. He is not valuable because he has fangs. His fangs are valuable because they become an expression of who he already is. Commercially, the strategy worked. The film was produced on a budget commonly reported around $80 million and went on to earn more than $470 million worldwide. That made it a strong financial success and reinforced the franchise's viability. Compared with the enormous production budgets often associated with major animated blockbusters, the result was particularly impressive. Sony Pictures Animation had demonstrated that a visually distinctive franchise could generate substantial global revenue without relying on the Disney or Pixar brand ecosystem. The international performance also mattered because monsters are culturally portable. Dracula, Frankenstein, the werewolf, and the mummy are recognizable across markets. The comedy could travel because the visual characters were easy to understand, even when specific dialogue jokes were less universal. The franchise could therefore build an identity around images as much as words. That is especially valuable in animation, where character silhouettes and expressions can cross language barriers. Merchandising and home media opportunities further extended the franchise. The characters were naturally suited to Halloween costumes, toys, clothing, and seasonal promotions. Blobby could become a simple toy. Dennis could become a recognizable child character. The Drag Pack could be represented as a group. The film's connection to Halloween created an annual marketing opportunity that many family franchises do not possess. It could return to television and home viewing every autumn, turning the movie into a seasonal ritual. Its success also helped guarantee the continuation of the franchise, eventually leading to Hotel Transylvania 3, Summer Vacation, television adaptations, merchandise, and other extensions. The larger lesson for Sony Pictures Animation was that a franchise did not have to originate from a fairy tale, superhero property, or established Disney brand to sustain multiple films. It could build a world around original combinations of familiar cultural icons. That distinction became increasingly important for Sony Pictures Animation. The studio would later become associated with visually ambitious projects such as Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse, and The Mitchells vs. the Machines. Those films are radically different from Hotel Transylvania, but there is a conceptual connection. They demonstrate a willingness to allow animation to have a strong visual identity, rather than forcing every CG film into the same polished, realistic aesthetic. Hotel Transylvania 2 belongs to that broader history of stylistic experimentation. It proved that a major studio could build commercial success around exaggerated movement and director-driven visual design. It would be wrong to say that Hotel Transylvania 2 directly created the visual language of Spider-Verse or The Mitchells vs. the Machines. Those productions had their own creative histories and techniques. But Hotel Transylvania helped demonstrate that Sony Pictures Animation could support a commercially successful film, whose identity was strongly tied to a filmmaker's unusual approach to animation. That institutional confidence matters. Studios learn from successful experiments even when the later films look completely different. The movie's historical significance, therefore, comes from its position between eras. It is unmistakably a modern CG feature, but its movement philosophy reaches backward toward classic 2D animation. The characters do not behave like realistic digital models. They behave like cartoon drawings liberated from the page. Tartakovsky's history in television is visible in every extreme pose and sudden acceleration. The film shows that 3D animation does not have to abandon the graphic exaggeration that made traditional animation so expressive. Mel Brooks's presence as Vlad adds another historical layer. Brooks belongs to a generation of performers who understood the comedy of classic monster imagery through films such as Young Frankenstein and his broader tradition of parody. His casting in a modern animated monster franchise creates a bridge between older horror comedy culture and a new generation of family audiences. Vlad is therefore more than a supporting character. His presence connects the film to the long history of turning monsters into comedy. That combination of slapstick and emotional stakes is arguably the movie's greatest achievement. A scene can begin with a ridiculous physical gag and end with a genuine emotional realization. The film does not always balance those elements perfectly, but when it does, the effect is surprisingly strong. Dracula can look absurd and still be heartbreaking. Mavis can be angry and still clearly love her father. Dennis can be cute without becoming emotionally empty. Years later, some parts of the movie inevitably feel dated. Smartphone jokes, specific pop songs, and mid-2010s cultural references carry the fingerprints of their era. Technology evolves quickly, and comedy built around a particular device or social media habit can lose some of its immediacy. But the physical comedy remains remarkably durable. Bodies stretching, characters colliding, Dracula panicking, the Drac Pack struggling with modern life, and the family arguing about Dennis all remain understandable, because they are based on human behavior rather than temporary trends. The emotional core is even more timeless. The relationship between a parent, child, and grandparent does not require a specific decade. Neither does the fear of disappointing your family. Neither does the desire to be accepted without having to perform an identity. That is why the movie remains particularly suitable for autumn and Halloween rewatches. It does not need to be the greatest animated film ever made to become part of a seasonal ritual. Its colors, characters, music, monsters, and humor naturally fit the atmosphere, while the family themes give adults a reason to keep watching after childhood nostalgia fades. And that brings us to the final question. Where does Hotel Transylvania 2 actually rank as a piece of filmmaking? It is not flawless. Its plot follows a familiar structure. Some jokes are disposable. Some technological references age quickly. Its most ambitious metaphor is occasionally buried beneath noise. And its final resolution gives Dennis the very transformation that the film spends so much time telling us should not matter. Those are real limitations. But judging the film only by those limitations misses what Tartakovsky accomplishes visually. The movie moves with confidence. It has a kinetic personality that many studio animated sequels lack. Characters do not simply walk into rooms and deliver dialogue. They bounce, stretch, collapse, fly, transform, and collide with the environment. The animation has rhythm. The comedy has choreography. The characters have silhouettes you can recognize immediately. Even when the script becomes predictable, the presentation rarely feels inert. Compared with many studio sequels that simply enlarge the original premise, Hotel Transylvania 2 understands that the characters have changed. Dracula is no longer simply a protective father. He is a grandfather confronting his own mortality and irrelevance. Mavis is no longer simply a sheltered daughter. She is a mother trying to decide what kind of childhood her son deserves. Johnny is no longer simply the outsider. He is now part of the family structure. And Dennis is not simply the next generation. He is the embodiment of everything the previous generation cannot predict. That makes the film stronger than its reputation might suggest. It is not as emotionally precise as the best Pixar films, nor as structurally polished as the strongest DreamWorks features. But it has something those comparisons can obscure: velocity. It is alive. It moves like a cartoon in an era when much CG animation was becoming increasingly committed to polished realism. Tartakovsky refuses to slow down his visual imagination simply because the medium is three-dimensional. Within the Hotel Transylvania series, the second film occupies an important middle position. The original introduced the world and its central emotional conflict. The third film expands the franchise into a road trip vacation adventure, and the fourth pushes the characters into another transformation. Hotel Transylvania 2 is the entry that most directly develops the family. It takes the acceptance lesson of the first movie and asks what happens when acceptance becomes harder. That makes it arguably the emotional hinge of the tetralogy. If the original is about Dracula opening the door to the outside world, the sequel is about him learning not to close that door on the next generation. The difference is subtle but important. The first film teaches him that humans are not the enemy. The second teaches him that his own expectations can become the enemy. And that is why Dennis's fangs matter so much. Not because fangs make him special, but because Dracula thinks they do. The entire movie is built around that misunderstanding. Dracula believes his grandson needs a particular trait in order to belong. The story eventually shows him that belonging came first. Dennis was already family before the fangs appeared. He was already loved. He was already connected. He was already enough. That idea reaches beyond monsters. Every generation eventually faces the temptation to turn children into monuments to the past. Parents imagine careers, personalities, traditions, beliefs, lifestyles, and futures for children before those children are old enough to understand the expectations being placed on them. Grandparents can be even more emotionally attached because they experience the passage of time differently. They see children as evidence that something of themselves will continue. When the next generation changes direction, it can feel like rejection even when it is not. Dracula's real transformation is therefore not becoming more accepting of humans. He already did that. His real transformation is accepting that love does not give him ownership over another person's identity. He can teach Dennis. He can tell stories. He can share traditions. He can explain where the family came from. But he cannot decide where Dennis will go. That is the difference between inheritance and control. A legacy is something you offer. It is not something you impose. And perhaps that is the most meaningful idea hidden inside this absurd little monster comedy. Family history matters. Cultural traditions matter. The stories handed down across generations matter. But they survive best when the next generation is allowed to transform them. Dennis does not erase Dracula's legacy by being half human. He extends it. Mavis did not destroy her father's world by marrying Johnny. She expanded it. Johnny did not weaken the monster family by entering it. He helped prove that the family could become larger without becoming less authentic. The hotel itself becomes the final metaphor. It was built to keep monsters away from humans, but eventually becomes a place where both can belong. The building remains. The history remains. The monsters remain. What changes is the meaning of the walls. They stop being barriers and become shelter. Dracula spends the movie trying to protect the walls of his identity. By the end, he understands that the family does not need walls to remain a family. And maybe that is why Hotel Transylvania 2 continues to work better than its simple premise suggests. It understands something that every generation eventually has to learn. You can love the past without demanding that the future repeat it. You can preserve traditions without turning them into rules. You can be proud of where you came from without deciding where someone else must go. Most importantly, you can love a child without requiring that child to become the person you imagined. Dennis's greatest power is not that he becomes a vampire. His greatest power is that his existence forces everyone around him to reconsider what being a vampire even means. He is human and monster, old world and new world, tradition and change. He does not solve the identity conflict by choosing a side. He solves it by making the categories less important. That is the lesson Dracula finally accepts. His family legacy was never really in danger. What was in danger was his ability to recognize it when it changed shape. So when the credits roll and the monsters return to their chaotic version of family life, the real victory is not the appearance of Dennis's fangs. It is the disappearance of Dracula's need for them. The grandfather who spent the entire movie trying to force a future into existence finally understands that the future was never his to control. And maybe that is the strangest thing about Hotel Transylvania 2. For a movie filled with vampires, werewolves, mummies, ghosts, bats, collapsing towers, viral videos, and enough slapstick to fill an entire haunted mansion, its deepest fear is completely human. It is the fear of being forgotten. And its deepest answer is even more human. You are not remembered because someone perfectly copies you. You are remembered because someone you loved carries something you gave them into a world you could never have imagined. That is what legacy really is. Not bloodline perfection. Not identical traditions. Not forcing the next generation to become a reflection of the last. It is giving people enough love that they can become themselves without feeling that becoming themselves means leaving you behind. Dracula spends centuries believing that protecting his family means controlling the danger around them. In the end, he discovers that sometimes the greatest act of protection is letting go. And for a character who can turn into a bat, disappear into the night, command an army of monsters, and survive centuries of history, that simple emotional act is probably the bravest thing he does. Hotel Transylvania may second be loud, ridiculous, predictable, and occasionally dated. But beneath the jokes, it understands the quiet terror of watching someone you love become something you did not expect. And it understands the harder lesson that follows. If you truly love them, you do not need to recognize yourself in everything they become. You only need to recognize that they are still yours to love. And perhaps that is why this strange little animated sequel deserves another look. Not because it secretly contains the greatest story ever written, and not because every joke has aged perfectly, but because somewhere beneath the frantic monsters and cartoon physics is a story about something almost every family eventually understands. The people we love will change. The world will change. The traditions we inherit will change. And eventually, if we are lucky, we will learn that change was never the thing threatening the family. Our fear of it was. So if Hotel Transylvania 2 meant something different to you when you were younger than it does now, that may be the most fitting tribute of all. Because maybe the movie itself has changed with you. As a child, Dennis is simply the funny little monster who cannot grow fangs. As an adult, he can look like something else entirely. A child standing at the intersection of everyone else's expectations, quietly waiting for the freedom to become himself. And that is where Dracula finally meets him. Not as a vampire, not as a human, not as a symbol of family legacy, just as Dennis, his grandson, his family, and enough exactly as he is.